I know. Everybody on YouTube has done a weld cart video. Well, what can one more hurt, right? I'd like to start this one off by introducing you to my welder. This is my Miller XMT 300, circa the mid-1990s. Now really, not that much great stuff came out of the 90s, and the same holds true for early inverter technology. These machines really didn't have that great of a reputation, but this one has been an absolute gem for me and has never let me down. I purchased it used from an auction in 2011, and this is what it looked like. It had obviously lived a pretty rough life. Once I got it home, I broke it down and cleaned the inside of the machine really well and did the necessary repairs to the outer fiberglass clamshell. And this is what it looked like when I was done. I then built it a nice little welding cart, acquired a bottle of argon, burned lots of welding rod, and taught myself the basics of lift arc TIG welding. This is it perched atop its welding cart, looking neat and tidy with the cute little argon bottle. Everything was just fine and dandy until I started looking at add-ons. I purchased a high frequency box to advance my TIG welding skills, as well as a S22 P8 wire feeder to bring my MIG welding capabilities to the next level. Both items got crammed onto the already small cart. This is what it looks like now. This welder has worked hard and proved itself worthy of a new cart. All of my projects follow a pretty basic routine. A beverage and a plan, then me tearing something apart, and then me trying to rebuild what I tore apart. This could take days, it could take years. Now to make it in my shop as a welding cart, there's a few basic requirements that you must meet. First requirement, you have to have 4 swivel casters, because otherwise you can't do this, and conditions in my shop can get kind of tight. Next, your casters have to be big enough to roll over cords, because my floor often looks like this. Next, you must have a wider base than a top. This adds stability and alleviates scratching and denting of the welder's sides. A scratched up, dented up welder is a small pet peeve of mine. All my welders sit at a slight incline. This prevents the top from being used as tool storage and alleviates scratching and denting, because a scratched up, dented up welder is a small pet peeve of mine. Okay, obviously it needs cord hooks, and it definitely needs a bottle holder, otherwise it's not truly mobile. And it's got to be well balanced and sleek. What I mean by well balanced is I have a small Lincoln MIG welder that uses small bottles. When you try to put a big bottle on it, it tends to get top heavy and tip. Definitely not cool. And what I mean by sleek is you won't see any fancy drawers or storage compartments for consumables on my welding cart. I used to do that, but I quickly outgrew that habit. In my opinion, it's like storing the oil and filters for your next vehicle servicing inside of your glove box. And last but definitely not least, it's got to be cheap. I'm proud to admit that I've never bought new material for a weld cart, because scrap looks just fine once it's been wire wheeled and painted with satin black. And so on that note, I went and raided the scrap rack. So what I'm starting with is a piece of 20 gauge sheet metal, and what I'm going to do is put a jog in it so that my wire feeder will sit slightly lower than my welder. So I'm just scribing in the marks, and I can put it in my pan brake. Yeah, that's a half finished pan brake that's made from, you guessed it, scrap metal. It's been kind of a fixture on my weld table for quite some time. It's time to finish it. But anyway, here's the piece of 20 gauge with the jog in it. I noticed it had a little bit of a forklift wound, so I'm going to go ahead and hammer that out. This is my railroad tie anvil that's made out of scrap also. Works good for just a little bit of body straightening. Alright, that's ready. Now the support structure that's going to sit underneath it is 1.5 by 1.5 by 1/8 wall box tubing. Now anytime you have a project like this where there's a multitude of 90-degree angles, it's a big time saver to set up a jig on your table where you're not trying to set a square on here and check all your angles. You could just quick put it in the jig and tack it up. Now you can kind of get the picture of what's happening here. This is getting put underneath, kind of lining it up and tacking it in place. Now you might notice there's a little notch missing out there. That's for the piece that will connect it to its vertical support. So now I can add on the second piece. And this was fortunately the only mistake on my cut list, which I was storing in my head instead of on paper. I subtracted 1.5 inches from both sides instead of just one. They call that move turning scrap into smaller scrap. So those pieces will get recut on the bandsaw, and I'll go ahead and continue on with the base. This is 2x3 by quarter wall angle iron. In its past life, it was a protective rail against loaders on the top edge of a walking floor trailer. I cut out the bent up areas and saved the straight pieces just for a project like this. Same routine, put it in the jig, tack it up, double check square, weld it out. Now this cart is going to remain 3-sided like this. I'm not going to add in that 4th piece to enclose this into a box. I thought it would give it kind of a cool look. Plus, it would prevent that previous problem of overcrowding and adding too much stuff onto the cart. And about this time, the new pieces were done being cut on the bandsaw. Back to work on the welder shelf. This is that piece that runs all the way through. You can see exactly why that notch was left out now. All this material with the greenish paint on it was a harvester tractor in its previous life. And I kept all of the usable pieces of box tubing. When it came to attaching this sheet metal to the box tubing frame, I opted to just tack weld it, as I didn't want to grind off the galvanizing and fully weld it out. As you may know, welding on galvanized without safety equipment, not recommended. Top piece pretty well done up. We'll clean that up a little bit and get back to work on the base. Alright, 2x3 by quarter wall box tubing, cut and notched to fit inside of the angle iron. This is a remnant from the frame build on my 1947 Ford. Looks like a glove. You can see this piece is getting placed right down the center of this 3-sided base. Measure once, measure twice, clamp it in place, remeasure. Now I just wanted to confess, I'm using my small Lincoln 180 MIG to build this cart. I think tradition dictates that you're supposed to use the welder that you're building the cart for to build the cart. My large wire feeder was starting to inconsistently feed the wire, and it is in need of some new rollers and a good cleaning. Therefore, I opted to use the small Lincoln. So again, I'm breaking with tradition, but please don't turn me into the authorities. Figure out what room is needed for my bottle. The bottle that's going to ride on here is 8 inches in diameter, so I just set the welder shelf up here and measured in a little bit over 8 inches. Now this is a piece of 2x2 by quarter wall square tubing. It is going to act as the main vertical support for the welder shelf, as well as what the bottle will be chained to. So you can kind of get the picture of what we're working with here. It's going to be kind of a bare bones, stripped down, basic welding cart. I'm not making any type of amenities for storage, as I mentioned earlier. I don't like to put my consumables on my weld cart. I think a long time ago I learned it was just easier to keep everything centralized in the toolbox. But if you like your consumables on your weld cart, that's fine. I didn't mean to directly offend anybody. More indirectly. So anyways, I've kind of ballpark figured out the height at which I want my welder, and then figured in the 5-inch casters also. I've got it clamped and tacked into place, and then I grabbed my angle finder because level on my table isn't perfect, and so I'm just matching the angle top to bottom to make sure that they're perfectly parallel. And then of course, final weld out, and then adding in additional gussets. Now there's a lot of leverage on this vertical 2x2, so it was definitely necessary to add in this piece. Now I had to clean up some welds so that I could add on the corner supports. The front of the XMT is going to have 2 vertical angle iron supports with handles attached. This is 1 1/4 by 1 1/4 1/8-inch wall angle iron. The more that these modern welders go to digital readouts and touch screens, I think it's crucial to protect that front of the welder. This is some 1/2-inch round bar from a well drilling rig that is getting measured, heated up, and bent into some handles and some cord hooks. I have a rosebud for heating up, but I really like the precise heat of the regular cutting tip. So I was heating them up, and I had a quick run over to the sink and quench them so that I could make the secondary bends. But those are the two handles. I typically like my handles about 2 inches off, so I measure in 2 inches in on both sides and bend the 90s. And these are the two hooks for underneath the machine that the MIG whip will get looped onto. So just 2 offset bends for those. Pretty easy. Now this is where it's always kind of important to stay fluid on your plans. I decided I needed to add in one extra piece on the back of my welder shelf. This is 1.5 by 2 inch box tubing, and I'm notching out the 2 inch side and I'm transitioning it down to 1.5 inches because the support structure of the welder shelf is 1.5, but the vertical support is 2, and I wanted a nice clean looking transition. So I got that piece all made up and welded it in. You can see I doubled down on this rear support. I figured by the time you put in an 11-pound spool, the weight of the feeder plus the 80 pounds that the machine weighs, it's quite a bit of leverage on that piece. Okay, now you can see exactly what I was talking about with the vertical supports here and the handles. This protects the front screen and switch area of the welder and also gives me a place to grab onto when I need to move the cart. And you can see on the back corner of the welder shelf there's also a piece of the 2x3 angle iron. That keeps the welder from sliding off the back. Oh, by the way, those vertical pieces of angle iron, the 1.25 by 1.25, was also scrap. It's an old bed frame. Final weld out. Then we can set it on the floor and move on to the casters. This cart has gotten fairly heavy at this point. Luckily I have an overhead jib crane. That's going to come in really handy when I'm in my elder years. Well, I forgot to explain where I was putting those hooks that I bent up. Those are underneath. You can kind of see them here. They'll keep the MIG whip tucked nice and neatly underneath the welder. Now these are the 5-inch casters I've got. I feel like caster technology has really come a long way in the last few years. I used to always bolt my casters on because inevitably a bearing would go bad in one of them. I haven't had a problem in I don't know how long with any of my casters, and I feel 100% confident in welding them on as long as you don't overdo it on the heat. That went really smoothly, and you can see I also added in some expanded mesh that I had, some scrap on the one side. That's where I'll keep my stick welding lead. Everybody's favorite part, the prep. Alright, satin black. Because why would you paint it any other color? Maybe that should have been on the list in the beginning. Yeah, it's got to be satin black. So I had a whole bunch of other projects I also needed to paint, so it was a busy paint day. The kids always love being part of a big project, so I always like to give them a few tasks here and there. So that afternoon we got everything cleaned up, put away, and brought into the shop. And that night, after everybody had dinner and was tucked into bed, I was able to make it out into the shop to do the assembly. This unit is heavy. It weighs 80 pounds, but I was able to lift it up there. Cord hooks for the win. Now there was a really big storm passing through on this particular night, and it was really loud in the shop. This is what it sounded like. Well, the feeder's in place. It attaches with 2 bolts through the bottom. Now I'm just attaching the leads and tidying everything up. I also set the bottle on there and chained it up. So this is our finished product. This is what the cart looks like, all done and assembled. I'm really pleased with the results. I like the way it looks, and I like the way it functions, and I like the fact that it doesn't have room to collect a whole bunch of stuff. Having my last cart overcrowded and inconvenient definitely showed me what I wanted on my next cart. And now that I have my Dynasty and my Syncrowave, I'm not so sure that that high frequency box is going to stick around. Thanks for watching. Be sure to check back frequently.